Right now, flying above the Earth, there are autonomous military drones, hypersonic missiles, and satellite surveillance systems that can intercept the encrypted data on your phone. They are the apex of American technological supremacy. They are the invisible shield that protects the global economy. But the foundational technology for every single one of those weapons, the very blueprint of the American military-industrial complex, was purchased with the blood of the Holocaust. For nearly 80 years, the United States government has sold you a meticulously crafted lie. They told you that the space race, the Cold War, and the defense of the free world were won by wholesome American ingenuity. What they deliberately scrubbed from the history books, what they hid in classified vaults, is that the architects of American aerospace and defense were high-ranking, blood-soaked officers of the Nazi SS. They weren't captured and interrogated. They were hired. They were given fake backgrounds. They were handed top-secret security clearances, and they were given massive federal pensions funded directly by your tax dollars. This isn't a fringe conspiracy theory. It is a documented, declassified paper trail of the greatest geopolitical betrayal in American history. And the terrifying precedent it set in 1945 is the exact same reason the Pentagon operates in total secrecy today. To understand how a betrayal of this magnitude happened, you have to understand the absolute panic gripping the Pentagon in the spring of 1945. The ashes of World War II were still smoldering in Europe. Berlin was reduced to rubble. But the American military establishment wasn't celebrating. They were looking across the Elbe River at the Soviet Red Army, and they realized a terrifying truth. World War III was already inevitable. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally. It was an existential threat with infinite manpower. And as Allied intelligence officers pushed deeper into Germany, they uncovered something that froze the blood in their veins. Hitler's regime was years, maybe decades, ahead of the United States in aerospace engineering, rocketry, and weaponized chemistry. The crown jewel of this terrifying arsenal was the V-2 rocket. The V-2 was not just a weapon, it was a technological leap that changed the nature of human warfare forever. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It traveled at supersonic speeds, meaning you couldn't hear it coming. It dropped from the very edge of space without warning, pulverizing city blocks in London and Antwerp. There was no radar that could track it. There was no anti-aircraft gun that could shoot it down. It was unstoppable. The United States military realized immediately that whoever controlled the minds that built the V-2 would control the absolute outcome of the Cold War. The race was on. A shadow intelligence unit known as the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, was formed. Their mission was singular and ruthless: find the Nazi scientific elite before the Soviet KGB did, and bring them to the United States. There was just one massive, unmovable roadblock standing in their way: the President of the United States. By early 1946, the Pentagon knew exactly who these German scientists were. They knew their ranks. They knew their unit designations. Harry Truman, recognizing the moral catastrophe of bringing war criminals onto American soil, signed a direct, undeniable executive order. The order explicitly stated that no active members of the Nazi Party and absolutely no individuals suspected of war crimes were permitted to enter the United States. The military intelligence apparatus looked at the president's order, and they threw it in the garbage. They committed an act of supreme coordinated treason against the civilian government. The JIOA realized that if they submitted the real dossiers of these scientists to the State Department for visas, they would all be rejected. So they began a massive, systematic forgery operation. If a brilliant rocket engineer's file showed he was a fanatic SS officer, military intelligence simply erased that page. If a scientist was flagged as a war criminal by investigators, The JIOA typed up a new glowing background report, claiming he was merely a reluctant civilian who secretly hated Hitler. They physically clipped a standard metal paperclip to the front of these newly forged files. That paperclip was a silent, covert signal to the border agents and military handlers processing the paperwork. It meant, this man is a high-value asset. We are laundering his past. Approve the visa immediately. Hence the name, Operation Paperclip. The United States military didn't just protect these men from the Nuremberg war crimes trials. They actively destroyed evidence to ensure the American public would never find out they were paying the salaries of monsters. At the center of this massive, federally funded cover-up was a man named Wernher von Braun. If you grew up in America, you were taught that von Braun was a smiling, charismatic genius. You know him as the first director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He is the architect of the mighty Saturn V rocket that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon. What the government deliberately hid from you is that Wernher von Braun was a commissioned major in the Schutzstaffel, the SS. He didn't just join the party to keep his job. He wore the black uniform. He was personally promoted by Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust. And more horrifyingly, von Braun's miracle Feed 2 rockets were not built by well-paid German engineers in bright, clean factories. They were built by slaves. The rockets were manufactured in a subterranean nightmare called Mittelwerk. It was a massive, damp, freezing tunnel system dug deep into the side of the Harz Mountains. The labor force for this underground factory was supplied entirely by the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. Tens of thousands of political prisoners, Jews, and prisoners of war were worked to death in these dark tunnels. They were deliberately starved. They were beaten with iron pipes. They were forced to sleep on bare rocks surrounded by human waste. If a prisoner was suspected of moving too slow or sabotaging a part, they were publicly hanged from the massive mechanical cranes used to lift the rocket engines. More human beings died building the V-2 rocket in those tunnels than were actually killed by it as a weapon. Wernher von Braun knew this. He walked through those tunnels. He stepped over the bodies. He personally traveled to the Buchenwald concentration camp to hand-select fresh slaves to work in his assembly lines. He was fully, undeniably complicit in a massive crime against humanity. By all rights of international law, von Braun and his inner circle should have been placed against a wall at Nuremberg. Instead, the United States Army dressed them in civilian clothes, smuggled them across the Atlantic on military transports, and set them up with comfortable upper-middle-class lives in El Paso, Texas, and Huntsville, Alabama. Arthur Rudolph, the man who directly managed the slave labor quotas at Mittelwerk, was given a top-secret security clearance. He became the project director of the Saturn V rocket program for NASA. He was eventually handed the NASA Exceptional Service Medal. Kurt DeBoos, a fanatic SS member who actually wore his SS uniform to work at the V-2 test stands, was made the very first director of the Kennedy Space Center. To this day, if you look at a map of the moon, there is a crater named after him. But the rocket scientists were only the beginning. The intelligence agencies were hungry for more than just space travel. The United States military imported over 1,600 Nazi specialists, expanding the program to include experts in chemical and biological warfare. They needed somewhere to hide them. So the military established a secret holding facility at Camp Evans in New Jersey. Behind barbed wire on American soil, scientists who had engineered the Holocaust were put to work for the Pentagon. One of those men was Dr. Hubertus Strughold. The United States Air Force brought him to Texas, where he was celebrated as a pioneer. He became globally known as the father of space medicine. The military even named an entire aeromedical library after him at Brooks Air Force Base. They conveniently forgot to mention that his medical research in Nazi Germany was conducted by torturing human beings. Strughold's department was responsible for the infamous medical experiments at the Dachau concentration camp, where inmates were frozen in vats of ice water and placed in low-pressure chambers until their lungs ruptured, just to see how long a pilot could survive a high-altitude bailout. He was never prosecuted. He died peacefully in Texas, collecting a government pension. The United States government didn't just hide their pasts from the public. They weaponized the American public relations machine to turn these men into wholesome idols. The military collaborated with major publications like Collier's magazine and even partnered with Walt Disney to put Wernher von Braun on national television. They used the media to launder his image, presenting him as a visionary grandfather figure who just wanted to explore the stars. The American public bought the lie completely. It took nearly 40 years for the truth to finally bleed out of the classified archives. In the 1980s, under immense public pressure and the work of relentless investigative journalists, the Department of Justice was finally forced to look into the Paperclip scientists. Arthur Rudolph, the slave master of Mittelwerk, was quietly allowed to renounce his U.S. citizenship and flee back to West Germany to avoid a humiliating public war crimes trial. He kept his NASA pension until the day he died. Wernher von Braun died an American hero. His SS past largely sanitized until long after he was in the ground. The United States government successfully executed this operation because they made a chilling, calculated decision. Technological supremacy is infinitely more important than human morality. When the survival of the empire is on the line, defeating the enemy justifies making a pact with the devil. And that is why Operation Paperclip is not just a dark history lesson. It is a blindingly bright warning about right now. The race for AGI, artificial general intelligence, is the modern equivalent of the V-2 rocket. If the United States military was willing to forge federal documents, lie directly to the president, and hire the architects of the Holocaust just to win a rocket race in 1945. What do you think they are doing right now to win the AI arms race against China? What ethical lines are being crossed today in secret, underground corporate server farms? What modern monsters, hackers, rogue engineers, and corporate mercenaries is the Pentagon granting absolute immunity to right now, simply to maintain technological dominance? The precedent was set 80 years ago. The government proved that when the stakes are high enough, the rules do not apply, and the public will only be told what they need to hear. The files are open. The truth is declassified. This is History Declassified.